Maplewood was one of those small towns that showed up on travel recommendation lists only occasionally, but whenever it did, the reviewer inevitably waxed poetic about its tree-lined streets and delightful local businesses. As a travel blogger, I had heard rumors that Maplewood's humble charm was a best-kept secret among those who sought a respite from big city bustle. Awe-inspiring forests, winding streams, and a tight-knit community, what more could I ask for? So I packed my camera, notebook, and sense of adventure, ready to chronicle every quaint detail for my blog's readers. The journey into Maplewood was picturesque, with rolling hills giving way to a narrow stretch of road framed by looming oak and birch trees, their branches arched overhead, forming a green tunnel flecked with nearly translucent golden sunlight. A wooden sign welcomed me on the outskirts, bearing the image of a maple leaf and the words, "Maplewood, a place to call home." Local legend said the town was founded by a family who had found solace here in the 1800s, escaping something ominous in the city. No one ever elaborated on the details, shrugging it off as ancient history. I, however, was always keen on discovering local secrets. It was, after all, part of my job. I drove down the main street, passing a collection of stores that looked more like they belonged in a carefully curated history museum than in a real town. A pharmacy with an old-fashioned sign, a hardware store with creaky floors, and a bakery exuding the rich scent of fresh bread, each welcomed passers-by in its own unique way. My destination was the Maplewood Inn, a charming Victorian-style bed and breakfast perched near the centre of town. Its bright white exterior boasted pale green trim, complementing the name painted over the front door in swirling cursive letters. A couple of rocking chairs sat on the wraparound porch, an invitation to slow down for a spell. Curiosity had always been my best asset, so it didn't take long for me to start poking around. The owner, Miss Adelaide Rutherford, was a woman in her late 60s with a beaming smile, her curly silver hair pinned back in a neat bun. She immediately welcomed me, asking if I preferred my breakfast eggs sunny side up or scrambled. After guiding me to a beautifully furnished second-floor room, she insisted on bringing me a tray of tea and biscuits, which arrived with a delicate porcelain teapot decorated in blue roses. The aroma alone told me the tea was top-notch. Settling into the floral armchair by the window, I took a satisfying sip, letting my mind wander to the story I might craft about Maplewood's understated allure. That first night at the Maplewood Inn, I slept peacefully under a handmade quilt. The bed creaked just the tiniest bit whenever I moved, lulling me into a comfortable doze. Early the next morning, I woke to slants of sunlight peeking through the lace curtains. I snapped a few pictures of the roommate's vintage armoire, the carved headboard, the crocheted doilies on the side table. Then I padded downstairs, determined to explore the nooks and crannies of the bed and breakfast for a blog post on old-world interiors. That was when I noticed the small door near the end of the second-floor hallway. It was partially obscured by a tall fern, and I doubted any traveler would normally even see it. Clutching my camera, I tried the handle only to find it locked. But the old wooden door looked like it might fit a skeleton key, the kind that belonged to a bygone era. If I was to get a thorough understanding of the inn's layout, maybe Miss Rutherford would grant me access. After all, she seemed to appreciate my enthusiasm for documenting unique travel experiences. So I made my way downstairs and asked her directly. Less than a minute later, she handed me a small, ornate key attached to a ribbon, cautioning me that the little storage room had never been fully refurbished and might contain dusty relics from decades ago. Intrigued, I hurried back upstairs. Upon entering, my initial reaction was one of mild disappointment. Boxes stacked haphazardly nearly reached the ceiling, leaving only a cramped path. Old linens and tarnished silverware spilled from half-open trunks. My camera's flash illuminated bits of dust floating in the air, but as I poked around a bit, my curiosity paid off. Beneath a stack of moth-eaten blankets lay a wooden chest. The rich patina on its exterior indicated it was quite old, probably older than Miss Rutherford herself. Inside, I discovered a set of diaries, their leather covers scraped and faded, The topmost book had a partially torn label with the date 1964. Something told me I was about to stumble onto a piece of Maplewood's past most travellers never glimpsed. Hands trembling with excitement, I settled on a small stool, carefully opening the diary. It belonged to someone named Harriet Wilson. The first entry I saw contained neat, flowing handwriting that spoke of complications at the orchard and urgent pleas for discretion. I turned a few pages, skimming curious references to hush money exchanged and hasty midnight meetings in the orchard behind the old community centre. Harriet's tone oscillated between fury and guilt, but the context was vague. Who was she giving hush money to, and why so many references to the orchard at night? Each new entry hinted at secret deals or clandestine gatherings that certain town elders were apparently part of. Could Maplewood have an unsavoury underbelly hidden behind its wholesome facade? I gently packed the diary under my arm, promising myself I'd return it safely once I'd gleaned more. Then I made my way back to my room, locked the door, and continued reading in silence. Harriet's words suggested a scandal that involved powerful people. Names like Mayor B and Dr. F peppered her entries. Two individuals, known only by cryptic initials CW and LH, kept reappearing in the pages, as though Harriet was writing in code. The orchard was repeatedly mentioned as the meeting place where secrets were discussed under cover of darkness. Reading on, I realized Harriet had worked as a typist for the mayor at the time. She wrote about forging documents on his behalf, rewriting the minutes of council meetings to remove mentions of a certain funding request. Something about these hidden references to local hush-hush dealings thrilled me and made me deeply uneasy at the same time. If Harriet had deemed it wise to hide the diary, maybe the secrets within still had consequences for Maplewood today. At breakfast, I couldn't look at Miss Rutherford the same way. I found myself scrutinizing her every expression, though she merely refilled my coffee and passed the marmalade with grandmotherly warmth. It felt as though the entire inn was steeped in illusions, and I was only just piercing the surface. Of course, I needed more context. So, after finishing my meal and exchanging pleasantries, I strolled around town looking for the orchard Harriet described. Now mostly used for summer festivals and seasonal gatherings, Maplewood's orchard sprawled behind the old community centre, which was a stately brick building with original stained glass windows. It was easy to see how a covert meeting could happen under the orchard's canopy of apple trees. Bright green leaves and twisted branches created a labyrinth of shade and rustling secrecy. Even in daylight, the orchard's hush felt intimate, as though it shielded those within from prying eyes. I wandered, camera at the ready, snapping shots of the orchard grounds. A caretaker, a lean, older man, was trimming branches. I struck up a conversation, introduced myself as a travel blogger, and inquired if he knew any local law surrounding these trees. He laughed softly, voice tinged with the patience of someone who had worked among the orchard rows for years. "Maps and secrets," he said cryptically. "People used to say the orchard had hidden passages long ago, but I don't believe it. If you ask me about real secrets, though, you'd need to talk to the folks who've lived here for decades." And with that, he returned to his chores, leaving me uncertain whether he genuinely knew nothing or whether he preferred to keep quiet. Growing more curious, I spent that afternoon in Maplewood's small library, a converted Victorian home filled with tall shelves and musty pages. A reference librarian named Jennifer was happy to assist me. She led me to a corner of local history texts where I scoured old newspaper clippings and records of town meetings. Sure enough, city council minutes from the mid-1960s had suspicious gaps. I found mention of Harriet Wilson only once or twice, her name scribbled in a margin as a secretary. Then there were unusual references to orchard maintenance budgets that never received follow-up. Not perplexing, the name Mayor Barstow surfaced repeatedly in local commentary, but records from 1964-1965 were conspicuously thin. As I pored over these documents, connections began forming in my mind. The orchard might have been a cover for off-the-books transactions. Perhaps property in Maplewood had been sold under questionable circumstances. One snippet suggested the orchard had belonged to the Wilson family before Harriet was forced to sign it over to the local government under some shady pretense. Was Harriet's diary the final testament of someone caught between saving her family and keeping official secrets? In the following days, I deliberated whether to mention my discovery to Miss Rutherford. After all, I had withheld the diary. By now, I'd been reading it in every spare moment. There were references to blackmail, the forging of property deeds, and even the disappearance of supporting documents meant to prove Harriet truly owned the orchard land. Late one evening, as I flipped through the last pages by the dim glow of a bedside lamp, I came across an entry dated September 10, 1965. Harriet poured her heart onto the page, revealing how she had hidden the orchard's deed in the basement of the Maplewood Inn, which, at the time, was owned by her cousins. The basement was sealed off with no sign, Harriet wrote. But if Meyerbeer found out, Harriet feared terrible retribution, including the possible shuttering of her family's business. Confronted with these revelations, I made up my mind. Harriet had left a trail for someone like me decades later to uncover the truth and perhaps afford her posthumous justice. The next morning, I asked Miss Rutherford for a tour of the inn's basement, feigning interest in wine cellars or any historical tidbits. She seemed hesitant at first, but my enthusiastic chatter about architecture and local law eventually won her over. With a slightly wary look, she rummaged through a keyring, guiding me to a locked door behind the dining room. We descended worn wooden steps into a low-ceilinged space that smelled faintly of damp earth and old plaster. At first glance, I saw only dusty shelves filled with extra linens and cleaning supplies. While Miss Rutherford flicked on a bare bulb overhead, I pretended to admire the stone foundation. My eye swept the walls until I noticed an odd patch in the far corner. A faint outline in the grey stone, like a rectangle that had been carefully sealed. My pulse quickened. That must be what Harriet had referred to in her diary. Miss Rutherford hovered close, her expression uneasy. Maintaining a calm demeanour, I pointed out a discrepancy in the mortar. She squinted. "I've never noticed that before," she mumbled. She stooped, pushing gently against the stone. A soft creak sounded, and the slab shifted. We exchanged startled whispers. Inside, there was a recess large enough to serve as a hidden niche. A battered metal box sat nestled in the darkness, coated in dust so thick that I brushed it off with my sleeve, coughing. Inside the box lay a stack of yellowed papers. At the very top was a legal document, a property deed listing Harriet Wilson as the rightful owner of several acres of orchard land. Date: March 3, 1964. A notary signature accompanied Harriet's own. Flipping through the fragile pages, I found more letters addressed to Harriet, urgent pleas for her to sell the orchard cheaply, threats that if she refused, her reputation in Maplewood would be permanently damaged. The signature on these menacing notes was scrawled as B, likely the mayor Harriet referenced. My heart thumped in my chest. Here were the final puzzle pieces to Harriet's story. She had been coerced into relinquishing her property for a fraction of its worth, no doubt so that certain officials could profit. Miss Rutherford gaped at the discovery. Shock and a hint of guarded understanding flashed across her face. "We should take this to someone who can set it right," she said softly. I could see the conflict in her eyes. Typically, Maplewood prided itself on its close-knit unity, but now a part of its history had been laid bare, revealing an injustice. I assured her I'd help figure out the proper channels, but I needed to tread carefully. After all, the names in Harriet's diary might connect to current town leaders. Maplewood was still alive with many of the same families, and an unspoken loyalty might keep them from wanting to revisit past scandals However, it was essential that the orchard's rightful ownership and Harriet's forced deception not remain buried in secrecy. That evening, Miss Rutherford confided in me as we sat in the cozy living room, the fireplace crackling. She admitted that years ago, when she first purchased the inn, her aunt had mentioned an old family rumor involving missing land deeds, but no one seemed to know the specifics, and Miss Rutherford had been too preoccupied with running the inn to investigate. Now, seeing the physical evidence was sobering. We decided to meet privately with a local lawyer, someone discreet but trustworthy, to see whether Harriet's estate or her descendants could still make a claim to the orchard. If the orchard now belonged to the town, was that arrangement legal under false pretenses? The lawyer's perspective would be crucial. The lawyer we chose was Angie Masters, a middle-aged woman known for her emphasis on community harmony, yet respected for her grasp of property law. When we showed her the diary and the old deed, she grew silent, eyebrows furrowing. She confirmed our suspicions. If Harriet truly was coerced, if those threats put undue pressure on her, then the orchard may have changed hands illegally. This may be a case of fraud if it can be proven. Of course, decades had passed, and many of the principal parties likely were no longer living. Even if any wrongdoing technically fell outside the statute of limitations, Maplewood had a moral quandary to address. Word travelled quickly, as it does in small towns. Soon enough, curious questions began drifting about. I tried not to fan the flames. My job might have been to spotlight Maplewood's charms, but I was in no rush to turn its potential scandal into tabloid fodder. Instead, I discreetly spoke to a few local historians and longtime residents. Many recalled Harriet Wilson as a quiet, reserved woman who always seemed to be carrying burdens unspoken. Mayor Barstow, on the other hand, was something of a polarizing figure. Some lauded him for reviving Maplewood's economy in the 1960s by selling orchard land for development. Others whispered about behind-the-scenes deals. No one had any concrete proof, but the story Harriet's diary told was chillingly plausible. One afternoon, a knock came at my door. Miss Rutherford told me the current mayor, a genial man named Michael Palmer, wanted to speak with me. He'd caught wind of some old documents that I had found. Bracing myself, I invited him into the parlor. He was surprisingly gentle in his approach. Mayor Palmer explained that he'd heard rumors of a hidden diary and deed that might call into question the orchard's ownership. He insisted he wanted to do right by Maplewood, but also underscored that a scandal might do irreparable harm to the town's reputation. He gave a knowing sigh as I recounted the highlights of Harriet's ordeal. Judging by his reaction, the orchard's real story would be unsettling to many, but bearing it forever wasn't an option I could condone. To my relief, Mayor Palmer seemed to agree. "I want Maplewood to remain a place of honesty and integrity," he said. "I'd rather see the truth come out than force a cover-up. We can handle the repercussions if it leads us to a fair solution." That was precisely what I needed to hear. It turned out that the mayor had grown up hearing whispered tales of a property dispute, but no one had ever offered proof. Now, holding Harriet's diary and seeing the old deed in person, his determination appeared sincere. He promised to call a special town meeting if we could gather enough evidence. And so it was that on a chilly Wednesday evening, Maplewood's community centre filled with townspeople curious about a major announcement. I was amazed at how quickly word spread. Perhaps, deep down, Maplewood had always known that something about the orchard's provenance was dubious, or maybe small towns simply had a way of collecting secrets like pressing flowers in the pages of a book, waiting for the right moment to reveal them. Mayor Palmer stood at a podium in front of rows of folding chairs. Flanking him were Miss Rutherford, myself, and Miss Masters, the attorney. The stakes felt high. One by one, the mayor introduced us, then explained the significance of Harriet Wilson's hidden diary and the orchard deed. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Murmurs of disbelief and shock quickly escalated into concerned chatter. Some older residents nodded gravely, as if everything was falling into place. Others bristled with agitation, perhaps fearful that new allegations might sully Maplewood's idyllic facade. But as Miss Masters presented the legal angle, and as we read aloud passages from Harriet's diary, it became increasingly clear that Maplewood's orchard had been acquired, at best, under questionable terms, and at worst, through an outright conspiracy to defraud Harriet Wilson. After the meeting, there was no riot or angry mob. This was a cozy town, after all, one that prided itself on neighborly compassion. Instead, groups formed in hushed discussion, grappling with the incontrovertible evidence. Several townspeople stepped forward to share recollections passed down in their families, tales of Harriet's heartbreak, of Mayor B, bullying vulnerable residents, of hush money that changed hands to keep Harriet silent. The orchard, a beloved community space, was overshadowed by what now felt like an inherited burden of guilt. It didn't take long for a consensus to form that Maplewood should right this wrong. If any members of Harriet's family could be found, the orchard should revert to them, or at least prompt fair restitution. The moral impetus to rectify the situation overrode fears about negative publicity. And interestingly, many in Maplewood believed that admitting past mistakes would show the town's growth and principle. I was moved by the collective integrity on display, though I knew it would be a complicated legal process. The orchard, after all, had become essential to community events like the annual Apple Festival, the 4th of July picnic, and numerous seasonal fundraisers. A search for descendants of Harriet Wilson began. We discovered that she'd had a sister who moved out of state in the 1977s. Through many phone calls and genealogical records, Ms. Rutherford and I helped Ms. Masters locate a distant nephew in another town. His surprise at being contacted about orchard land in Maplewood turned to quiet reverence as he learned of Harriet's perseverance and hidden diary. In the weeks that followed, the nephew visited Maplewood. Standing amid the orchard's blooming apple trees, he admitted that Harriet's story never reached him. He had no clue that this land had once belonged to his family, nor that Harriet's quiet heartbreak had shaped Maplewood's history. Emotions welled up around us. In that moment, the orchard felt both haunted and full of promise for healing. Eventually, the town council worked out a fair settlement, with the orchard technically remaining public property but paying a restitution sum into a trust for Harriet's surviving relatives. A plaque was commissioned to honor Harriet's legacy, ensuring no one would forget the truth again. During the unveiling ceremony, I watched Miss Rutherford standing beside the nephew, both wearing grateful smiles, though a touch of sadness lingered in their expressions. Maplewood was turning a new page in its history, one that recognized its complicated past while choosing a more open path forward. As for my blog post about Maplewood, it ended up being more than just a typical travel piece. True, I highlighted the bed and breakfast's old-world charm, the corner bakery's cinnamon rolls, and the orchard's gorgeous blossoms. But I also shared, in gentle terms, how the town had unearthed a once-buried injustice and come together to make it right. I refrained from naming names or dwelling on lurid details. After all, Maplewood's character was best embodied in its willingness to own its imperfections and move on with compassion. Strangely enough, that post became one of my most read stories, with many readers commenting on the power of revealing and healing long-held secrets. In the days before I departed, I felt a bittersweet bond with Maplewood. The orchard, swaying in a light breeze, no longer seemed quite so secretive. Instead, it felt like a living tribute to Harriet, a place for neighbors to gather with open hearts and maybe share difficult truths beneath the leafy canopy. I took one last stroll down the main street, snapping a few more photos. I lingered outside the Maplewood Inn, recalling the moment I discovered those diaries. Mrs. Rutherford joined me on the porch, where we sipped tea and watched the sunset tint the sky with oranges and pinks. "It's a new beginning for all of us," she said softly. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon. Sometimes we find what we need in the most unexpected places, don't we? Thinking back on Harriet's diary and the chain reaction it had sparked, I nodded. Absolutely, I replied. And I'm glad I was here to witness it. With that, I carried my suitcase to the car, leaving behind a Maplewood that was perhaps more honest, more complete, and somehow even cozier. In unearthing Harriet's hidden words, we hadn't merely uncovered a scandal, we had illuminated a path for the whole town to come together, bridging the gap between memory and truth. And as a travel blogger, I knew I'd encountered something profoundly real, a story that went far beyond scenic vistas and quaint shops, one that had changed Maplewood, and me, for the better.